Archaeology porn.
Okay, so for today's archaeology porn, we're going to discuss one of my favorite things. It's the largest hoard of medieval gold and silver ever found in Britain. It's called the Staffordshire Hoard, and it is smokin'. So for this story, let's start at the present and go back to the past. In 2009, your friendly neighborhood detectorists, and a lot of our stories start with them, don't they, named Terry Herbert, got permission from farmer Fred Johnson to detect in his fields near the town of Hammerwich, which is in the county of Staffordshire in the Midlands, UK. And pretty soon, he struck gold. On July 5th, 2009, he started pulling the first gold objects out of the ground, and 5 days later, he had unearthed 244 pieces already. And at that time, they knew they had something on their hands, so they contacted the local representative of the Portable Antiquities Scheme, and that's exactly what you're supposed to do here in the UK, so they were playing by the book. However, now that you're attuned to archaeologists and how we think, I know what you're probably thinking, which is, but it's all about context in archaeology. They've lost the context. This is terrible. Well, you're thinking in the right direction, but in this case, not really. You see, all of these objects were pretty much loose, scattered around the plow soil. And in fact, that field had recently been plowed, so it was disturbed and it was churned up. And if we're talking about early medieval times, this field had been plowed over for more than 1,000 years since these objects were deposited. So we didn't really lose the context, it was lost. The thing that's very much suspected about the context here is that the objects were in some kind of cloth bag or bags, because they did find small or even microscopic pieces of cloth on some of the objects. But other than that, there's not really much known about how they were originally deposited. Now, of course, the authorities, seeing all this gold, realized this was the real deal. They got the permission to excavate, of course, which Farmer Fred gave them, and we're off to the races. And pretty soon it became clear that there was a lot more of the stuff under the ground. And that meant this was going to be, at least some degree of a lengthy excavation. And that created a problem, because you've got all this gold just lying around in the field, and lots of people involved in the dig. So they really, really had to keep it on the hush-hush, really far down on the down low.
Everybody just shut up! Shut your mouth! Shut the up, you cunt!
And shutting up with so many people involved definitely was not an easy thing to do, but they managed to basically accomplish that because nobody really found out what was going on before it was announced. Now, they were definitely not helped by the fact that the farm was right up against the A5, which is a major roadway in Britain, and it actually has been since Roman times. So this was one of the major roads that the Romans constructed through their territory, running basically from all the way in the southeast coast, I believe in Kent, and through London, and all the way up northwest, up into, I guess, Wales. And that was still in use during the Anglo-Saxon times. They renamed it Watling Street. So that's the A5, which ran right by the property. And then on the other side, there was another major motorway, the M6. So there was a lot of sort of passers-by who might have been wondering why there was a giant hole being dug in the field. But as I said, they must have largely succeeded because nobody interfered with the dig. And after all was said and done, they pulled about 4,000 fragments of precious metal out of the ground, comprising about 700 individual objects. In total, it was 5.1 kilograms of gold and 1.4 kilograms of silver. Now, that's about 11 pounds of gold and 3 pounds of silver.
Holy Mary, Mother of God. Look at that.
Now, to be fair, there was a little bit of it, 91 pieces that were picked up in a subsequent excavation in 2012, but, 95% plus of it was taken up in that 2009 investigation. So what happened next? The public announcement came in September 24th, so they must have been working in the field for, a month or so, and it created a huge public sensation internationally, because after all, that was more gold and silver that was found than in the Sutton Hoo ship burial, which of course is England's most famous medieval treasure ever found, and one of the featured highlights of the British Museum. So the Staffordshire Hoard outstripped that in terms of the amount of precious metals. So from there, Britain's Unique Treasure Act process takes over, and that entails the coroner, so the same dude who deals with the dead bodies in the county, declaring this to be treasure. And from there, it belongs to the crown. So like the king and queen. At that point, it was the queen. And they auction it off to the highest bidder. Now, of course, the museums and educational institutions get first dibs ahead of private buyers. But this was valued at £3.3 million. That's a heavy lift for any museum to take on. But luckily, the Potteries Museum and Art Gallery and the Birmingham Museum and Art Gallery pooled their resources, raised the funds, and they bought it. And we're lucky they did, because if that was not the case, it might have gone into private hands and even been divided. And those museums are where you can see it today if you want to visit it. At the Potteries in Stoke-on-Trent, and the Birmingham Museum and Art Gallery in Birmingham, although the latter is closed for renovation now. There's also pieces of it on display, a few pieces in the Tamworth Castle, and also Lichfield Cathedral. Now, it's kind of a shame that it's separated up like that. I think most of it is in Stoke-on-Trent, but it's separated in four. But the reality is they had to give dibs to the ones who could pay for it. And if they hadn't pooled their resources, it wouldn't be on display for the public. So that's just the reality. But wait, what about our friends Fred and Terry? Well, don't worry, they were well taken care of. You see, under the Treasure Act, the amount of the sale, even though it was done via the Crown, doesn't go to the Crown. It's split between the landowner and the finder. And I believe under the law, they can have some kind of prior arrangement, and if there is none, it's 50-50. So they both got, £1.65 million. Now, I'm not really sure what happened, but they actually had a very public falling out and have done a lot of talking of each other in the press. Now, they're both accusing of each other of wanting to hoard, well, the hoard. Okay, so not 100% happy for them, but I'm sure they're okay with their millions. So, beyond the drama, what is in this hoard? Well, the answer is a lot. So first, some background. Based on the style of the items, it was immediately apparent that this was early medieval from the Anglo-Saxon part of Britain. And how did they know this? So first, the pieces are largely comprised of garnets, the precious stone, which is pressed into designs made with gold wire. So it's a kind of an inlay. And that technique is called cloisonné, and it's very, very emblematic of that period of time. Also, there are animal figures incorporated all over the items, sometimes mixed with very strange human-like figures as well. And the twisting, repeating knots crawling all over everything, that is also very common in Anglo-Saxon art. And in fact, the archaeologists, even without any dating, were able to get much more specific than the general time period. You see, the Anglo-Saxons built almost exclusively in wood. So there are very, very few structures from this time period. Really, if you're digging up an Anglo-Saxon village, what you see is stains in the ground. However, what they did a lot of is burying their dead with grave goods, particularly in the earlier part of the Anglo-Saxon period. So we do have tons and tons of material that were buried with the bodies. And over time, archaeologists, really over the last 200 years, have developed very, very tight seriations of objects. So how did a particular brooch change over time, every 10 years, and then even across counties? So they had a very, very specific idea of when these goods, dated from. And it became pretty clear that the date of this deposit was from 650 to 675. So there were objects that were older than that based on the seriations and the dating. But the fact is, the stuff had to be deposited after the newest thing, the most recently created thing was made. And that date, that final date, was anywhere from 650 to 675. So the hoard was deposited sometime after that. And more clues. So among all of these 700 some objects that were found, all of them were basically related to war. Weapons, armor, stuff like that. There was literally nothing that could be female, associated with female orientation in the whole hoard, rings or jewelry or anything else. It was all war related. Another clue. Now, even stranger, all of it had actually been deliberately destroyed, wrenched apart, torn apart, ripped apart, and crushed up. Really weird. If you have this much bling, why would you ruin it? And that's a really important clue. And that's also one of the reasons why, even though it had more gold than the Sutton Hoo burial, it was much more fragmentary. So that's perhaps the reason why, to this day, Sutton Hoo is still more famous, and you see, bad Hollywood productions about it. So, folks, that's what we've got. A whole bunch of gold and silver war gear, which was ripped to shreds and just plunked in the ground. And that happened after 650 to 675. That's what we know. And what are the specific pieces worth mentioning? Well, first and foremost, there are tons and tons and tons of pieces of swords. Sword pommels, sword handles, little bits and bobs that I don't even know the name of. But guess what? No blades. There was not a single blade found. That's pretty weird, huh? But in any event, from having so much material, they learned quite a lot about it. First, the material was from all over England, and they know that because there has, as I mentioned, been so much material found in the past with burials, that there are known to be different sort of sub-regional styles. And it's believed, I think, that most of this stuff came from East Anglia and Kent, which in the early medieval times were sort of where it was at. So this stuff came from all over England, a lot from East Anglia and Kent. Second, with just so much material, they did learn a bit more about how these weapons and other objects were manufactured, how they were put together. You have to remember, they didn't have modern tools and microscopes. It's incredible, the tiny scale of the workmanship. And through some of the repairs and other pieces that may have been damaged, they got to see how these things were put together. And thirdly, this is really cool, like in other finds of this nature, although not ever this big before, a lot of these materials seem to have been in use long before they were put into the ground. So you see that in Anglo-Saxon tombs where people are buried with weapons and brooches. Those are much older than the burial. So what that means, combined with the fact that each piece was sort of individually designed and uniquely created with its own look, and they were all different, that combined with the fact that they were, many of them, old when they went in the ground, strongly suggests that these were heirlooms. They were made for a specific person or clan or family, and they were kept as some kind of an identifier or just that person's unique, piece. And there has been some thought that there was a belief that swords especially had kind of spirits, and the fact that they were held on to and so unique, that sort of plays into that storyline. So that was basically the bulk of the hoard, all this stuff about swords and weapons. But the showstopper was the Staffordshire Hoard helmet, which rivaled the Sutton Hoo helmet in terms of sheer badassery. Now, what you're seeing on that grizzled old warrior is a reconstruction, of course, not the original. But the specialists in this case are able to infer crazy amounts of stuff from just fragmentary pieces. However, to be fair, this did involve quite a bit of imagination, just like the reconstruction of the Sutton Hoo helmet. You see, the helmet, like the other weapons, was found in pieces and it had to be put back together. But what's so cool is there have only been fragments from a few helmets in the entire early Anglo-Saxon period. And the reason for that was at this time, a helmet was a signifier of a king or a very high status person, not a crown. The crown was adopted later. So it's very likely that this helmet was sort of like the crown belonging to one of the kings of the 7 kingdoms in the Anglo-Saxon heptarchy.
If we choose you, will you wear the crown? Will you lead the 7 kingdoms to the best of your abilities?
And another oddity, there's almost nothing that bears any inscription or writing that gives us a clue as to what all this business is about, except one gold strip that does have a short inscription on it, which is the Latin translation of a portion of Psalm 67. And this says, "Rise up, Lord, and let thine enemies be scattered. Let those that hate thee flee before thee." So yeah, that's a pretty good hint this had something to do with war and fighting. In fact, it's a pretty good guess that this strip may have been attached to like a weapon or a belt as a kind of good luck charm for the battle. And this verse was not rare in Anglo-Saxon England. It's found elsewhere, and one of the things it's associated with is Saint Guthlic, who was a saint associated with Mercia, perhaps the royal dynasty of Mercia, which is the kingdom where the hoard was found. So that's a good connection there. And finally, there's a few crosses, but 2 in particular I want to focus on. There's one that's understood to be a pectoral cross, so something worn. And that honestly is almost totally complete. It's just a bit bent, one of the arms. So that's a really in good shape. And there's another one, which is also among the more complete pieces in the whole hoard, which is in its entirety, but it's all folded up and folded in on itself, and it seems to be missing its precious stones, which probably would have been garnets. Now that's interpreted as a processional cross or an altar cross. So something that may have been put on an altar or something that may have been sort of carried around in a parade. And very well, both of those would have made it into battle, because we know from written accounts at this time that priests and monks and bishops went into battle to pray for their side. But even more, we know full well that at this time, those same holy men, they often fought and led armies themselves. We knew there were bishops that were going around marauding, burning, pillaging. So yeah, at that time, the church and warfare were not mutually exclusive. So that was just a quick tour, but you get the idea. There was so much that it was absolutely overwhelming. So after it was discovered in 2009, the hoard was cleaned up, and then it went on some temporary displays. It even took a little trip to the United States where it was displayed there. And what was really cool at that time was they left on purpose some of the mud from it, so you could really see how it looked when it came out of the ground. But this period of study did last from 2009 to 2019, so 10 years, and it was continued to be studied even after the permanent exhibition opened up in 2014. So I guess maybe they were rotating the materials or studying them part-time. And obviously they learned a lot of really cool stuff with all the sciencing they were doing. One of the things, of course, was they found those smaller microscopic bits of cloth, which suggested it was in a bag. They also were able to chemically analyze some of the resins and adhesives that were used to hold the gemstones, the garnets, in place. So those were some cool learnings. Now, another one I'd like to mention is what's called peaks analysis, or particle-induced X-ray emission analysis. And what that did was it was able to analyze the garnets and essentially match them to the profiles of garnets elsewhere and say where they came from. So I believe some of them came from southeastern Europe, like Hungary, but others came as far away as India, Sri Lanka, or maybe Southeast Asia. So that shows that, yeah, England might have been a backwater at that time, but it was a backwater that was connected with long and global trade routes that stretched even beyond the known world at that time. So now for the fun part, whodunit? What the was all this gold and treasure doing out in the middle of a field that was far away from major settlements even at the time that it was deposited? So let's look at our clues. It was found in Mercia. The treasure was deposited anywhere from 650 to the 680s or 90s. It was full of riches, but those were really callously destroyed, sort of wantonly ripped apart, and in a way really disrespected. And among those things was the remains of a helmet, which would have been tantamount to a crown at this time. So putting it together, what does that all mean? Well, one clue comes from a text. It comes from Beowulf, which you may have read when you were in high school, perhaps. Now, that's an epic tale, and why it's so important historically is, remember, these are the Dark Ages, so there's very little writing from that time that survived. So a lot of the clues as to what warrior culture was like in those days, they come from Beowulf. So now let me read one specific passage of Beowulf, and I'm going to have to read it because it's too long. One warrior stripped the other, looted Oguntheow's iron mailcoat, his hard sword hilt, his helmet too, and carried Graith to King Hygelac. He accepted the prize, promised fairly that reward would come, and kept his word. They let the ground keep that ancestral treasure, gold under gravel, gone to earth, as useless to men now as it ever was. So this passage describes warriors stripping off the pommels and ripping apart the, gear, the kit of their defeated enemies. So that very well might be what happened here, because just like in the book, it was deposited in the earth, useless to men as it ever was. So who could have done this and why here? Well, even though it was the Styx in the 7th century, the deposition spot was right next to Watling Street, which was still used as a major thoroughfare during these times, going right through the kingdom of Mercia from southeast to northwest. Also, even though it wasn't very close to any major settlements, it was in between some of them. So not too far away was Lichfield, where a major cathedral of the kingdom would later be built. Also Tamworth, which would later become sort of the capital of Mercia. And capital should go in air quotes, because at this time, the way the royal court and the king worked is they kind of traveled around the whole kingdom constantly and sort of ate and feasted at different places and just kind of reminded people who was boss and made judgments. So that's how they rolled. But Tamworth would go on to become the closest thing that Mercia would ever have to a capital. And who would have been doing a lot of fighting at this time to having collected all of these weapons? Well, I like to think first of King Penda. He was the last great pagan king in Anglo-Saxon England. So yeah, he would not have had a lot of respect for those crosses that were all crumpled up. Now, Penda was an all-around badass who basically completely dominated his era. In fact, so much so that after he was known as one of the Bretwaldas, I forget how many of those there were over the course of Anglo-Saxon history, maybe 6, 7, I can't quite remember. But Bretwalda was basically an overlord king who dominated all the others. So only technically king of his own kingdom, and there were 7 of them, but he became sort of the hegemon, we can say. It's important to remember, however, that that term was not used at this time. It was used retrospectively. But in any event, Penda was pretty much a boss. In fact, he killed at least 3 other Anglo-Saxon kings, maybe even 5. So yeah, he did dominate. Well, fate eventually caught up with Penda. Now, we're only getting this from one source, which was the Venerable Bede. And he was a monk who was living a pretty isolated existence in Jarrow, which was in the kingdom of Northumbria. And remember those monks, they were very interested in geese and eclipses and the dates of Easter, not so much in warfare and women and, the other stuff we'd want to know about. So Bede wasn't too interested in the details of the fighting, but this is what he does tell us. That King Penda went to Northumbria to fight and give the smackdown to Oswiu, who was the king there. And he cornered Oswiu in a fort somewhere. He does name the place, I just can't remember offhand. And he forced Oswiu to pay him a tribute, and then he got up to leave. Because that's what a lot of warfare was about at this time, just getting someone to sort of say uncle and pay you off. Now, in the night, it seems that some of Penda's troops, forces under his command, deserted him or left. It's not clear exactly, but they left. Not totally surprising, because a lot of the forces fighting under his banner were not him. Remember, he was a boss, so he got a lot of people to fight for him who he had defeated or cowered into doing that, so they didn't necessarily like him. And it seems that after he was sort of headed back to Mercia, he was either ambushed or attacked by Oswiu at a weak point. So even though Penda had won the engagement, Oswiu wound up cornering him and defeating him and killing him eventually. So that was the end of Penda. Now, what could have happened here? So that all went down at a place called the Whodunit. So it was called the Battle of the Whodunit, where Penda was eventually killed. And we don't actually know where that is. But one thing that very well could have happened is Penda collected all this war booty, buried it as per Beowulf, and then was going back to Mercia, and that's when he was killed at the Battle of the Whodunit. Or it could have been that he was killed at the Battle of the Whodunit and had all this stuff that he was actually bringing back with him to Mercia. And then one of the people who escaped, because a few did, not all of them were killed, then took this stuff and buried it, intending to come back and collect it, but never got the chance. So those are some pretty good explanations to all of these, putting all these facts together as to what would have happened. But honestly, we will very likely never know. But Penda would be a good guess because of all the fighting he did. And it is within our time period. The Battle of the Whodunit was recorded by Bede as 655, which is at the earlier part of our 650 to 680, 90 kind of time frame, but definitely still possible. And even if it wasn't to do specifically with Penda, it very likely could have involved him because, remember, he was the overlord king guy. So after he was killed, there was obviously a lot of instability in Mercia and between the different kingdoms. In fact, Oswiu, shortly after Penda's death, came to dominate Mercia. One of Penda's sons took power as the king, but he only lasted a year or something, and then another son came. So it was a time of great instability and a lot of fighting, so this could have had to do with that period of time. But once again, we'll probably never know. Now, as I mentioned at the beginning, you could come by and see this bling in person at the Potteries Museum and Art Gallery in Stoke-on-Trent, or at the Birmingham Museum and Art Gallery in Birmingham. However, as of this recording, that latter one is closed. So if you're going to see it soon, it will have to be in Stoke-on-Trent. Now, the exhibition is free, but be a good sport and leave them a donation. As you'll see, the museum is clearly lacking for funding and overall is pretty lackluster. However, the amazing pieces of the hoard, the absolute bling, will take your breath away. But don't fog up all that glass as you're leering at this smoking archaeology porn, because you'll find yourself just staring at it. There is a general lack of depth in the captions. It's not like there's nothing written, it's just rather shallow. But this video, plus other things you can read up on, will probably tell you all you really want to know about the hoard. But if you want to read and see more, there is an absolutely beautiful book on the collection, which has, just delicious photography where you can really get a close-up view of the archaeology porn. So remember, the next time you're in England, you will definitely want to make it to Stoke-on-Trent because you won't want to miss this. Hey, if you like what you heard, give me that thumbs up below, hit that bell to subscribe, or if you want to support more independent archaeology content, consider contributing to my Patreon, where you can enjoy some exclusive members-only benefits and other goodies. Until the next dig.